So please bear with us as other colleagues start streaming in. So once again, good morning, colleagues. Good afternoon for those of you who are joining us from other parts of the Eastern Hemisphere, as well as potentially for some of you who are up very, very early in the Western Hemisphere. My name's Elizabeth Cedaropolis. I'm the Chief Executive at the South African Institute of International Affairs, and also part of the African chapter of the network of Southern think tanks. And it's really a great pleasure to have you join us in this, I think, very important discussion that is part of a series of discussions that we, as part of the broader network, global network of Southern think tanks, are engaged in. My colleague Pilani Mtembu, who heads up the Institute for Global Dialogue, will be moderating, but he's having some challenges, some technical challenges this morning. So I thought I would kick off, and when he's able to join us, he will do so, but just in the interest of time. 2 years into the pandemic that has caused a huge loss of life and deepened poverty and inequality in many parts of the world, and 6 years after Paris and the adoption of Agenda 2030 and the SDGs, the economic, social, and environmental challenges the world, and the developing world in particular, is facing, I think, have been exacerbated. I think that's not too controversial a statement to make. The SDGs, Paris, the fight to combat the COVID pandemic, have all been premised on partnerships. Partnerships between the North and the South, partnerships between governments and civil society, partnerships between the public and the private sector. And we just need to cast back to the Millennium Development Goals and MDG 8, which was around that. And of course, in the context of Agenda 2030, SDG 17. Partnerships are partly about finance. We know, for example, that the $100 billion pledge annually that was made on climate finance and Copenhagen is not sufficient. Never mind that we haven't actually achieved it yet, but is not sufficient to enable a just transition in the developing world, which will have to bear the brunt of climate change, will have to deal with adaptation, not just mitigation, and which has not been the primary villain in the climate tragedy. But partnerships are also about know-how, they're about capacity building, they're about technology transfer and co-creation. Partnerships are also, we mustn't forget that, about removing some of the glaring obstacles to development that exist in the rules that govern international trade, international taxation, the global financial system, intellectual property rights, and so on. And lastly, I think partnership is also about recognizing that we can tackle transnational challenges if we walk together. You know, that great African proverb, if we walk together, we can go further than if we're walking alone. So this is the real high talk. We all recognize, of course, that the reality is very different in practice. So the question, and this is what we're hoping to be able to address in this discussion this morning, the question of what kind of development partnerships do we need to achieve the SDGs has to be driven by two issues, by urgency and by practicality. Today, we're really honored to have as our keynote speaker, Dr. Ibrahim Mayaki, who probably needs no introduction. He's as the CEO of NEPAD, now named the African Union Development Agency. He has for more than a decade been really intimately involved in many of these African and global debates, and even before that. He was also kind enough to provide an endorsement for our handbook of development cooperation for achieving the 2030 agenda, which was 2 years in the works with partners from around the globe. That was a partnership in the spirit of this discussion, and we're grateful for that. The book is a door stopper. It's a cultural weapon. There we go. My co-editors there, and was of course supported by the BMZ and executed by the Network of Southern Think Tanks and the German Development Institute, and it was published earlier this year. It is available on open access.
Elizabeth, we can have a picture with this, with
yes.
all of us holding it.
There we go.
I hope somebody would take it.
Yes, excellent. It's available on open access, so by all means we'll post the link. Please feel free to download it. It's also great to have with us today, apart from Dr. Mayaki, two of my co-editors. They have had copies of the book. Stefan Klingebiel from the German Development Institute, and of course our leader in the Network of Southern Think Tanks, Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi, who is also the Director General of the RIS in Delhi. In addition, it's also great to have with us a partner particularly of SIRE. We've done a lot of work together, Patrick Anam, who's a trade analyst at Development Reimagined. Great that you were able to join us. Thank you very much. The program, before I hand over to Dr. Mayaki, our program also had Dr. Sarah from the APRM Secretariat. Unfortunately, she has been called to a meeting, to a mission. In fact, she's traveling today and has sent us her apologies at short notice. We were, of course, unable to replace her. That's a real pity. We hope to be able to have her in one of our discussions at a later stage. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me then stop here and really invite Dr. Mayaki to make his keynote remarks. Thank you again, Dr. Mayaki.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's an opportunity also for me to once again congratulate Saya on all the good work you are doing, and how close we are to your publication, your insight, your analysis, that help us on the African Union side. And let me also recognize the panelists who are here present. And most of the key issues that I might raise are in this book, so I might be bothering you by repeating some of the issues that have been highlighted here. So I'll focus my intervention on 5-6 issues. The first one is rethinking partnerships to achieve SDGs. Made me think about another expression, but we are using now quite a lot, not only within the African Union context, but beyond, which is rethinking development. There's an important discussion taking place. And in the last 2 days, for example, we received ambassadors from Addis, from the African Union, to engage with them on our programs, the impact of our programs. And President Beki, former President Beki, attended this meeting. And most of the discussions revolved around rethinking development. I know this discussion started to take place before the pandemic, but it seems that the pandemic has been an accelerator of this question. Evidently, by using the expression rethinking development, one needs to agree on the content of a concept itself. which would open a much bigger debate. But I wanted to highlight this point just to establish a link between rethinking partnerships and rethinking development. What development are we talking about, and what partnerships are we talking about? Now, my second point, which is a practical experience I had in the last 18 months, since the beginning of the pandemic, I co-chaired the high-level panel that the UN established on illicit financial flows globally, which was called the FACTI panel, Financial Accountability, Transparency and Integrity panel, which are about 75 experts coming from all over the world. And the main reason for the establishment of this panel before the pandemic, but we worked virtually during the pandemic, the main reason was to tackle an issue that the President of the General Assembly then and the President of the ECOSOC in 2019 considered as critical for the implementation of the SDGs, which was the financing of the SDGs. As you know, we are lagging behind in Agenda 2030. Financing has not been really, I could say, optimal, much less than optimal. Many instruments had been put in place since the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, but they found that, when I say they, is the President of the General Assembly and the President of ECOSOC, found that trying to push for the implementation of commitments taken multilaterally in a weakened multilateral system should be accompanied by other measures and other types of solutions. And one solution they came at was look at all the issue of illicit financial flows so that domestic resources could be opened and made available for the implementation of the SDGs. And it came at a moment when, as we know, during the pandemic, the illicit financial flows didn't reduce, they increased for many reasons which are not linked to the topic I'm going to discuss today. But my second point is that the financing issue is a clear filter which allows to indicate what is the quality of the partnerships that have been set up in order to implement the SDGs and Agenda 2030. My third point will be to link in the African context Agenda 2030 to Agenda 2063. Africa was the first region, and I think the only one, which went to the negotiations on the SDGs with a common position, which was Agenda 2063, fundamentally based on, insisting on the development of productive capacity, economic diversification, economic integration. So we had an agenda, a form of definition of what green industrialization could be. So we went with this agenda to have the discussions in New York on the Agenda 2030. And for us, most of the items which are present and priorities which are present in Agenda 2063 have been reflected in Agenda 2030. So as we implement Agenda 2063 in a very uneven manner, as Auda NEPAD, we are responsible for the evaluation of the implementation of Agenda 2063. So we know relatively well how it is being implemented, and it is uneven, as I was saying. So as we implement Agenda 2063, from the African side, we also implement Agenda 2030. So the reporting we do on Agenda 2063 and the reporting on Agenda 2030 at national, regional, and continental level. So why am I saying that? Because the implementation of Agenda 2063 is also partly based on establishing sound partnerships on critical flagship programs. And these flagship programs go from infrastructure, for example, energy, and all the partnerships that have been established on transport, the Single Africa electricity market, the Single Africa air transport market, etc. Each one of these flagship programs is based on partnerships with UN institutions, multilateral institutions, partnerships with civil society, partnerships with the private sector. Because the private sector in the implementation of Agenda 2063, especially in infrastructure, is going to play a very important role, especially through the PPPs. So whether we take Agenda 2030 or Agenda 2063, and we look at how partnerships have helped implement these two agenda, we are faced with a reality that financing has not been evolving strongly, but commitments that were made were not really implemented. And in Agenda 2063, if I take the climate agenda, I refer to the Green Fund commitments, we all know what effectively happened. So when I look at these 3 points, by my conclusion regarding these 3 points is that after COVID, which has shaken all our agendas, whether Agenda 2030 or Agenda 2063, we are faced with a reduction globally of resources and with a weak multilateral system, a weakened multilateral system, and an advancement of nationalistic positions politically. So within this context, within this atmosphere, how can we reignite old partnerships, and how can we think about new partnerships? I think the old partnerships as they exist, if they pursue in their same mind frames, mindsets, attitudes, and processes, will always lag behind the expectations that we have. So I would not spend time talking about the old partnerships. There is quite a long list of them. We have been participating in from Paris to Accra to Seoul, etc. And the global partnership scene is seems to be less visible than it was previously. Development aid is being quite shrunk, even if I attended the DAC assembly of OECD 2 months back, and they were giving numbers which were showing that there was an increase in terms of aid. But if you look carefully, there is a mixture of data where sometimes the boundary between military aid and development aid is not very clear. So I'm not sure, but you panelists are more specialized than I am in this issue, and they might correct me. So commitments fading, develop ODA being reduced, and a reduction on resources from, for example, the African side. So the partnerships, the new partnerships now, if we talk about the new partnerships, I think they should be anchored around the fundamental consequences of the pandemic. My thinking, which is not evidence-based, I'm sorry to say it, but my thinking from all what I sense is that we have moved, for example, in the African context, from Agenda 2063 to a COVID agenda. What are the important questions that are on the table? How do we strengthen CDC? How do we strengthen domestic financing of health? How are we going to quickly create the African Medicine Agency? Because pharmaceuticals will be a critical global issue in Africa when we double our population to 2-point-something billion. So on these issues, the insurance market in Africa is being looked at by the big insurance companies because Africa can be the next market of in terms of insurance business. So when we look at how COVID has shaken our agenda 2063, we realize that most of the priorities that are being flagged now are linked and around COVID, so the pandemic. So the consequences of a pandemic become the foundation to rethink the partnerships and become the foundation to rethink our priorities. We are going to enter in the design of a new 10-year segment of Agenda 2063. And we have 3 priorities: health systems, food systems, and jobs. Food prices are rising. FAO is telling us that we might face the same context that we faced in 2008 when food riots did erupt. In terms of health systems, we need to accelerate, evidently, all the manufacturing of pharmaceuticals and vaccines. And that has to be a priority. And in terms of economic recovery, 80% of Africans who work are in the informal sector and in micro, small, and medium enterprises. So this sector has to be prioritized. So the new partnerships that we see emerging are more and more partnerships with our local communities because they were somehow forgotten in all the planning processes that we're doing nationally, because we used to have a top-down mindset in terms of planning. It has to do with the private sector, and the private sector is not only global big business, it's also medium enterprises, African medium enterprises, and medium enterprises from India, from Colombia, from Mexico, etc. Which leads me to the question of South-South cooperation. We have, as Auda Nepal, a strong cooperation that we have established with the Colombian presidential cooperation system, for example. We do things together, we try to learn together. So private sector on the one hand, South cooperation on the other hand, and on the third hand, I think the network of think tanks is absolutely crucial because you produce stock of ideas and there is a huge demand of ideas in order to rethink development at policymakers level. To tell you the truth, as a development agency continentally of the African Union, if you ask me to give you a definition of what green industrialization is, you will embarrass me, because green industrialization has not happened in the history of the world up to now. So, but at the same time, I would say, well, it needs very strong innovation. It needs specialized knowledge. It needs transfer of knowledge. So this knowledge, which is dispersed everywhere, should be connected. And my fundamental reflection, and I will end there, is we need to go in the new partnerships towards knowledge partnerships. The issues related to financing will still be there, but if we want to make a leap and adapt to the new context of this COVID agenda, quote unquote, we need to go towards partnerships which are fundamentally focused on dissemination of knowledge, and you are perfectly adapted to this new context. So I think I've spoken the time I was supposed to speak, did I? Oh. So let me stop here, and thank you again for inviting me, and I hope I didn't bore you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mayaki. I think that was great, and exactly what we wanted to kick off the debate. I see that my colleague Pilani Mtembu has resolved his technical challenges, and so I'm going to now keep quiet and hand over to Pilani for the rest of the discussion. Pilani, great to have you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you, colleagues. Apologies for that. I've actually had to connect with my phone. For some reason, I'm not able to connect on my laptop. But colleagues, I'm glad I could get and hear Dr. Mayaki's input. And I think it really touches on very key areas that are related to this particular discussion. What type of partnerships are the ones that we have to actually create that will actually take us to 2030? Especially with what Dr. Mayaki said, is that not only focusing on the formal partnerships, I mean, you mentioned something very pertinent to Africa, in a sense that we're not only talking big business, especially when we're talking the continental free trade area. We are also talking about small and medium enterprises, and I think this is something that has to then be factored in. We're talking about the informal sector. So the type of partnerships that you're mentioning are not necessarily a traditional understanding of partnerships. We have to tailor them to an African context, but also to a context of the developing South. And the question is, what role does South-South cooperation play in actually bringing about the type of partnerships that Dr. Mayaki was speaking about? We know that because of the pandemic, that key indicators of human development have actually gone backwards or stagnated. So the task we are facing moving up in the decade of action is much tougher than the one we were facing even prior to the pandemic. So I'd be very interested to hear from our discussants, Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi, who's currently the Director General at the Research and Information System for developing countries. And, you know, to get his inputs and to also get inputs from Dr. Stefan Klingerbill, who is chair of the Research Program, International and Transnational Cooperation of the German Development Institute. Then we've also got Patrick Anam, who is an international trade policy and trade law expert based in Nairobi, Kenya, and focuses on international trade law, trade policy, and regional integration. So the topics I think that our speakers focus on are very well directed towards the inputs of Dr. Mayaki. So with that, colleagues, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi for just some of his reflections. And colleagues, in reflecting this, I'd also like to highlight that a key term that was mentioned for this handbook is the idea of contested collaboration. So as we think about the type of partnerships needed, is to also factor this concept of contested collaboration. Dr. Chatuvedi, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, my dear friend Pelani. Thanks, Elizabeth, for giving us this opportunity and for taking the initiative of having this panel discussion organized. Let me also profusely thank Dr. Mayaki for capturing the broad contours, and I think he has done it remarkably well. He said it as if he was boring us, but I think he has helped the panel in terms of capturing the broad nuances. And I think the point towards the end that he mentioned about a new network of think tanks is needed, new ideas are needed for what Pelani rightly said, contested cooperation. So we have differences with the North, there is little doubt. The differences are because we are at different stages of development. We are at different levels of challenges that we are ending up with. So those contestations are largely emanating out of different challenges that are there. Now, within the South, also countries are reaching at different levels of development. And those contestations are likely to go further and further. So how we work together, how we evolve the idea of leveraging collective strengths, how we as an academic address the challenge of theorizing those perceptions. How do we theorize and understand and elaborate that for pedagogic purposes, but also, as Dr. Mayaki rightly said, supporting the policy formulation process. How do we do that? And these processes, these contestations, these cooperations are going to give us the strength, the gravitas, and the process with which we can evolve. And for that purpose, to all of you who are interested in this publication, my dear colleague Stefan has already placed the URL in the chat box to access this book. And I think Elizabeth has just placed this NAPAD link that would further give you the way all of us are thinking collectively on some of these areas. So I think the idea of dashboard, the idea of policy reflective analysis, the idea of setting up in the post-pandemic world a new contestations and contested cooperation, as Pelani rightly pointed out, are some of the issues which this book has tried to do in terms of different narratives and different norms. As of now, the norm-setting countries and norm-taking countries were divided. We are seeing that the growing number of multilateral institutions that are ending up with log jams are precisely because the norm setting and the norm taking are in a sort of contestation. And this contestation is emerging out of the huge lopsided growth processes. So those who presume they are the world leaders and have all the right to set the norms are no more the leaders when it comes to economic processes. The shifting center of gravity of economic development is giving the new substance, is giving the new ground for these contestations. As an academic, we have tried to point out, and in this handbook, these possibilities where cooperation is still possible. How these contestations can actually be turned into cooperation framework, and how the whole process of multi-stakeholder landscape is becoming more and more complicated. How these complications can be addressed by these contested cooperation that we discussed. Elizabeth, in her opening remarks, alluded to the idea of Goal 17. And she's absolutely right. If partnerships have to appear, partnerships have to appear for sustainable development goals, and sustainable development goals are not Goal 17 alone. They are for health, they are for nutrition, and they are interdependent, what we saw at COP26. So these cooperations are no more to be avoided, postponed. We have no luxury of time anymore with us. Cooperation is the way forward, and cooperation in a contested situation is all the more the time to embrace and go forward and see how some of the challenges of globalization, and particularly the idea of ODA, which was one of the key instruments, is unfolding, the cyclical dynamic processes, and how those processes are driven by different value systems and different priorities. But there are now many more modalities than ODA, which this volume captures. And I would very much like to invite you to read the book to see what other modalities are and how Southern actors within the South-South cooperation also play an important role in taking the idea of SDGs forward and trying to coordinate these sort of contributions that all countries would be making towards Agenda 2030. As I said, there are several sections in the book which are trying to capture the essence of this cooperation through a huge set of theoretical frameworks. And there again, we have tried to capture, like if you see the chapters by Chan and Ikabuta and Mallow and Lee, also the chapter that I did with Milindo, also Mr. Clark-Leigh's chapter. These chapters have tried to capture the ideas, the frameworks where contestations are paving way for cooperation. And the idea which we have captured in our chapter is about the global public goods. North has been creating global public goods for long. How South should come forward and take the responsibility of creating global public goods. India has taken up this idea of CoWIN, which is a platform for distribution of vaccines. The inequities in vaccine that Dr. Mayaki mentioned. We need to see how technological solutions are low-cost solutions which are easily adaptable by countries. And in this volume, we have tried to explore some of those dimensions where access, equity, and inclusion related issues on vaccine can be adequately addressed. When this volume, as Elizabeth said, when we did this exercise, it was 2 years ago. And for almost last 1 year, this volume is with us. So we had no idea of the pandemic. And we had no idea that this book would be referred to when the pandemic is likely to be over and some of the remaining challenges are being addressed by countries. But this volume is rich enough to guide us even when countries are resetting the development priorities for themselves. So I would very strongly recommend this book to all our participants today, simply to understand, if you have interest in theoretical frameworks as to how these contested cooperations are possible. We are within a world when primacy of SDGs is there, but also in terms of how we see globalization of aid and its diffusion, how we see the idea of discursive institutionalism, which is likely to pave way for, as I said, contested cooperation. The very effort for orchestration, the theoretical frameworks, the powers that are there, and the book has several chapters which deal with the role that middle powers are likely to play, and what kind of contested cooperation is possible when we are talking about the middle power theories, and middle power theories, how they determine the process of this cooperation and contestation that Pilani mentioned. It is also very well captured in a full section on how we go beyond these contestations. So I think those chapters are important. The theoretical institutional frameworks have been discussed, like, for instance, is the GPEDC an institution with enough bandwidth to engage several countries which have different priorities and different norms? Do they really follow the norms that OECD countries have laid out for setting up of GPEDC? Are some of the questions which our scholars, our co-authors have addressed. I would once again very warmly welcome you to read this volume. We are here today in this panel, but please feel free to contact our authors and co-editors for explaining further the ideas and the theoretical frameworks. Elizabeth, I would stop here. Thanks, Pilani, for this opportunity, and back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that overview. And I think I would like to pick up on an area that you touched on, this changing normative landscape, this growing plurality of in the international development landscape. When we go back in time, we find that for many decades, the OECD, but particularly the OECD Development Assistance Committee members, were very influential in shaping the discourse on international development, on the role of the state, on the role of society, the role of private sector, all various key development questions. But what we have seen is growth of also ideas, a growing number of ideas on development. And these are coming from the South. But also, one thing that is important, the question, and this sort of leans into Dr. Stefan Klingerbiel's remarks, is, Stefan, you are located in the global North, but you work very much within the global South. And the question is, as we have seen partnerships emerging within the global South, to what extent are some of those ideas, and Dr. Mayaki also mentioned cooperation in the form of ideas, to what extent are these ideas and practices of cooperation from the South also having some type of an impact or even a bridge building impact with actors in the global North? So I'd be really interested in your sort of overview and response from Dr. Mayaki, but also touching on not only the global South, but the linkage between South and North. So Dr. Klingerbiel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Pilano, for this nice introduction. Yes, I'm based in the global North. That would be a nice discussion. What is our identity? Is it based on our location, or is it different? But this would be probably a good topic for another round of discussion. But just at the beginning, let me really thank you, Elizabeth, Saya, Nest Africa, Nest Global, Sachin, and all dear colleagues and friends for making this happen. And also to Dr. Mayaki for his keynote speech. I think, Dr. Mayaki, you really touched upon a number of very important issues. The link between the partnership discussion and rethinking development, I mean, this is really even more fundamental, but I think to establish this link is something what is important. And I also penciled down the knowledge partnership aspect, and this is something what I'm going to work together with a group of young researchers for the next couple of months. So that's really a very important aspect. But let me just make 4 quick points for my brief intervention. My first point is, and this is very much related to this umbrella thinking, how knowledge is generated is important. And this is relevant in academic terms, what kind of results to expect, but also in terms of policy advice. And I would say, what we as a team of editors, we as a team of authors, we're trying to do is to have a good diversity and plurality of contributing authors. So we have 33 chapters with 45 authors. Many of those chapters are co-authored by researchers, think tankers from the Global South and the Global North. So I think this is something what is important. And this is how knowledge is generated, very much in this kind of thinking, how knowledge partnerships needs to be established. So this is really a very important aspect. And let me mention here also one more aspect. I think that we were able to finish this door stopper book project is based on trust. And trust is nothing in what we can have just because based on one online discussion. So this is based on a very good network with the network of Southern think tanks, with our Managing Global Governance program, a number of intense workshops in the context of BAPA plus 40, UNDCF, GPEDC, the daily process. So what I want to say is, this is an investment. This is not just one product. This is really, you know, plurality, diversity. This is based on trust. And I think this handbook is a good indication what we should try to do more often. Yeah, this kind of combination. My second point, very much in line what Sachin, what Elizabeth, what others were already saying, is about the framing and the definition of our policy field. And this kind of framing and definition is something what is really important. And we are trying to do it in the handbook. And I think to have development cooperation as a framing idea, which includes different types, ODA, traditional aid, South-South cooperation, triangular cooperation. This is important, and we are trying to pinpoint to some most important challenges in this regard. How about comparability? How about measurability across different types of challenges when it comes to those different types of modalities? And sometimes we are even not coming up with a solution to it, but just to identify this is something what is important. And this brings me to this key term, and I'm happy that some colleagues were mentioning already that development cooperation is an example of contested global governance. And as we all know, global governance is the search for cross-border solutions. And we see that global governance as such, multilateralism as such, is contested, is increasingly contested. And it's not over just because we had one election at the end of last year in a quite big country. So this is something what is ongoing. And let me just highlight one aspect we are discussing in our introduction. Contestation includes mainly two main aspects which are highly relevant for our development cooperation field. This is a politicization of international authorities, and politicization in the sense of international relation debates. This means that actors are trying to shift institutions, to shift the content of institutions. And let me just provide one example. This ongoing attempt to expand the ODA definition. Dr. Mayaki was already indicating this. This is a shift. This is an institutional shift. And this is a form of politicization. We also have something like this when it comes to the definition or definitions of South-South cooperation, but this is one form of contestation. And another form of contestation is to create counter institutions. Yeah, and as we all know, we have the new development bank, we have the Asian infrastructure bank, etc. So this kind of contestation in our field of development cooperation, we have a lot of evidence for it. So in a way, it's a perfect illustration that global governance is contested, and we also can break it down to our field of development cooperation. My third point, very much related to it, and Sachin also touched it already, the discussions around norms for development cooperation, norm diffusion and norm competition. We all know that norms are shared understandings that make behavioral claims. Yeah, so we have norms at home with our children, how to have dinner, all these things, and we have it also in international relations, and this applies also for development cooperation. And let's say those norms are typically based on narratives, on concepts. So for example, for ODA, we have that ODA should promote economic development and welfare in developing countries. For South-South cooperation, and I know this is already a bit touchy, it's the underlying concept on narrative is solidarity. This needs to be break down to norms. For ODA, as we all know, we have those nice specific norms, the grant element and all these things. So even those technical aspects are not easy. So I would say this is a set of norms. This is a bit more complex for South-South cooperation. But what we are discussing in our handbook in a number of chapters is that what Sachin was mentioning already, we are coming from a development cooperation history where the norm making was made by a specific platform, the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD. They were the norm makers. Then we had this kind of attempt to come to a situation of norm fusion. That was the Busan high-level meeting in 2011. So let's overcome this traditional DAC working party for aid effectiveness. Let's create a new animal. And this has led to the GPEDC, and I'm not going to the history of GPEDC, Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, but what we know from the two high-level meetings we have had so far in Mexico and Nairobi, this has led to a situation of norm confusion. Norm confusion. Yeah, this is true for development cooperation as such, but also to the main subtypes of development cooperation. And this is a very important, I would say, lens how to look at our topic. My fourth and last point is what I would label on as a paradox, and this is based on our great joint discussions with our dear colleagues and friends. So we have a strong need for more and better cooperation. And I think one aspect I also want to highlight is that our handbook is coming to the conclusion that we need to have better cooperation. And we are saying the right term for better cooperation is collaboration. So go to those chapters where we are discussing it. So we are in need of collaboration. And the reality is very different. The reality is very different. So more need for better cooperation, for collaboration, but reality is different. And I think one main aspect is the rise of new geopolitical conflicts. And this is affecting development cooperation very much. I think this is really something what we saw at the very beginning of development cooperation in the 60s, in the 70s. It never went away, but now it's really popping up. And this is in many regions and countries something what is really dominating many discussions. And I think just looking back for the last few years, this is really changing our debate. My hope would be that development cooperation can provide a small window of opportunity to have some different discussions. Yes, we know development cooperation, looking at some discussions like Belt and Road Initiative, etc. This is to some extent even the center of some discussions. But development cooperation might be also a window of opportunity. And this brings me to my final sub point here, that I would look at the handbook to some extent as an attempt of track 2 diplomacy. Yeah, we are trying to bring together different actors. Yeah, we are not government, the co-editors, the authors. We are not government representatives, but we have a good understanding about, you know, the rationale of some main actors, and we have those discussions how to try to bring some kind of consensus to the debate, how to create informal spaces, etc., etc. So in this regard, I would say hopefully the handbook, and it's the handbook and the network, etc., etc., might make a difference. And with this, back to Pilani. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stefan. I already see someone wanting you to elaborate on your concept of norm confusion. I think also an interesting area that you touched on also is what constitutes. Of course, we are still using language that is old. So, you know, you mentioned what constitutes, for instance, is it your geographic north, or is it the ideas that you're actually espousing? And of course, we have to understand that the South is not homogeneous and the North is not homogeneous. And at times you might have ideas that are being discussed in the South which resonate with stakeholders in the North even more, or some stakeholders in the North even more than perhaps some stakeholders in the South. But this is an interesting environment, you know, that is emerging, at least especially when it comes to ideas. Patrick, Anam, I'd like to bring you in now and just to elaborate and go into some of these discussions, but also, you know, also to bring in more the aspect of, you know, we're talking partnerships, and trade is a very important area when we're talking about partnerships for development. You know, how Africa, for instance, goes about managing its trade relations, both internally, but also with external actors, whether it's China, India, the US, the EU. So the trade aspect in a developmental field that is changing, I think is quite important also to this discussion. So Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Filani. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, professors who have spoken before me, and also, of course, Dr. Mayaki for his powerful keynote address. Yes, so like has been mentioned before, I come from the policy world, but at the same time, I usually enjoy a lot academic discussions. Because in any event, it is the academic discussions and norms and theories that inform policy interactions and therefore policy analysis. And yeah, so Filani, you mentioned trade and how it can be centered in achievement of SDGs, especially for Africa. And so before I make my remarks, I just want to wish to state that other than being a specialist in regional trade and international trade law, currently I'm also a trade analyst with Development Reimagined, which is basically a consultancy which is Africa-led and based in Beijing and also based in Kenya and in London. And so we interact a lot with the practical aspects of relationship, especially between China and Africa, not only on trade, but also on infrastructure, investments, and of course, movement of people. And so I listened to Dr. Mayaki keenly, and he mentioned quite great points, which of course are the bedrock of some of the works we do and some of the projects that we put across out there. And so I would start by mentioning that he did talk about new partnerships. And I think, and he also mentioned South-South cooperation. And then he obviously mentioned that we are in a COVID moment, meaning therefore that COVID-19, especially for the global South and specifically for Africa, has perhaps exposed the more not talked about vulnerabilities, but those which are existing. I mean, you're talking about the huge inequities caused by vaccine, lack of access. You're talking of economies who've spent most of their finances towards recovery measures or towards measures that are preventing the spread of COVID, and thereby taking them away from the originally intended purpose of providing, for instance, social services like water, like other public goods, as it were. And so I want to talk about trade in one aspect, that there are, as development reimagined, there are certain reports which we've produced lately, and one of them which was published in June is focusing specifically on reimagining a relationship between China and Africa. And so when we talk about SDGs and we talk about the continental frameworks, and we talk about the flagship projects in Africa, our research, and as you all know, there's a lot of interlinkages. So that, for instance, we in that very paper I've just mentioned, part of the discussion that we went ahead to produce some data around is the linkage between, of course, Dr. Mayaki had already mentioned that there's an obvious linkage between Agenda 2030 and the Africa continent, the AU's Agenda 2063. So therefore, in that document, one of the things that have come about, especially as regards trade relations between China and Africa, is that we went ahead and attempted to link Agenda 2063 with the the 6 continental frameworks and the Sustainable Development Goals. And an interesting read comes about because we come to the conclusion that actually out of the continental frameworks, which are 6 in Africa, we are only able to locate 2, which is the boosting intra-Africa trade and also the comprehensive Africa agriculture development program. Now these are sort of linked to the original what has been going on between China and Africa in terms of the Forum on Africa-China Cooperation. And so the last meeting that occurred in 2018, for instance, in Beijing, the declaration that came out of it specifically mentioned these 2 frameworks, that they were supposed to be cooperation towards the support. And now we went further and looked at the individual projects that are on the continent and whether they are being implemented are actually affecting these continental frameworks. And so we found out that whereas they are mentioned in the declaration is there are still huge challenges because there's no linkages. For instance, if you may speak of the Continental Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program, what has been as informing the cooperation between China and Africa on agriculture has been aspects like Africa technical demonstration centers. But then we find these are, the effect of them are yet to be felt because, as it were, we still have parts of Africa where there's hunger. There's also a disconnect in the sense that the cooperation is based on the fact that China had at some point been able to, do so well in agricultural development. However, there's a challenge in linking those programs directly to Africa and making them beneficial because, for instance, the Chinese system is based on Chinese agronomists. So whereas there are these centers that are being established, what our research finds that there's that human capacity deficiency because we do not have agronomists on the other side to come and demonstrate on this other side. And now in terms of boosting intra-Africa trade, of course, you can only boost trade by breaking down the barriers, starting by the border barriers, starting by putting a connecting infrastructure. We also find that whereas in China has extensively, is a huge development partner for the continent in terms of infrastructure. Some of them indeed most of the infrastructure are not linking country to country. And without linking country to country, we therefore deny these countries from having an interconnected transport system that can ease the transportation of goods, people, and services, and thereby not being able to enable trade. And when that is not enabled, it means the cross-border traders who are women are not able to benefit, and therefore you therefore do not achieve the SDGs that are linked to this kind of programs. And so I think I wanted to mention that. Then second report is regards public health. Of course, you mentioned COVID as a big issue. One of the papers again that our organization has put out is the paper on decolonizing public health, whereby we of course this has been informed primarily by the experiences of COVID, the vaccine hoarding, the inability of Africa to produce its own vaccine, the huge technical capacity gaps that are existing. But again, there are some positives from this analysis in the sense that you see China being able to, for instance, offshoring production of pharmaceuticals and vaccines in Egypt and Tunisia. Now, these are now partnerships that I think we can learn from, and other parts of the world can also join in, because like Stefan correctly mentioned, there are a lot of contestations, and then there are also geopolitical tensions, which looked at from an Afrocentric point of view, and could actually negatively affect the ability of countries multilaterally to cooperate in terms of achieving the SDG goals, which is health, reduction of poverty, and agriculture, etc. So I think those are sort of some of my opening remarks I would mention. And then when you mention of trade, of course, there's the AFCFTA, which is just but one of the flagship programs under the African Union. And so it is, of course, trade has begun sometime this year, but there's a lot of tension at that level also, because there's lack of coordination among, for instance, the regional economic communities on the continent. There's still non-tariff barriers across the board. And so with some of these barriers, some of which are, of course, caused by internal policy incoherence, and others caused by the ability or the desire for countries to claw back onto the agreed upon or the narrative that was initially flowing of multilateral globalization. So there has been some force towards deglobalization, which perhaps African countries, for some reason, seem to take a cue from. But I think these are just some of the ideas that we can explore going forward. But I think I would leave it at that. Otherwise, I really enjoy the book. I'm still reading it, and I think, like Elizabeth rightly pointed out, it's a cultural treasure, and I think it will inform a lot of these think tanks projects going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Stefan calls it a stops even heavy doors. I can attest. Colleagues, I know that we started a bit late and we had some technical issues. I would like to request that we have at least one round of questions, but also just to read a few of the comments that are in the chat. There are some questions in the chat and in the Q&A that I will not see on my side because having joined with the laptop later. So when I transferred from my phone to the laptop, then some of them got lost. But I'll read what I see. And if Elizabeth, if there's something that I've missed out, if you could just come in. Someone wanted to just find out if Stefan could address more in detail the important aspect of norm confusion. There's also a comment saying, given the lessons learned from the vaccination inequalities and wastages therein, how do we look at norms of cooperation with
Philani, you have frozen.
Oh, sorry. I think if I freeze, just take over, Elizabeth.
Okay, Philani, maybe I can just add, because I think it's useful to just take the questions, I think, in totality. So I see that there was also a question from Stefan Fischler, which I think Dr. Mayaki is typing an answer to, which speaks to where is Africa's leverage when the African Union or regional organizations are really united in international settings. There is the point that you raised about norm confusion. I think you were talking about the norms of cooperation with the Health Compact when you broke up. So the vaccination inequalities and wastages, how do we look at norms of cooperation with the Health Compact? And there was another question from Stephen Karakezi, who said, Dr. Mayaki's emphasis on the importance of forging new partnerships, the bringing in of SMEs and MEs is truly insightful. Might the partnerships of MEs and SMEs in Europe and Africa in the successful horticulture sector of the region provide a model for forging new partnerships targeting SDGs and Agenda 2030-2063? And I think he's also posed a question about, can the contested governance provide less industrialized parts of the world new opportunities for easier access and transfer of essential technologies and know-how that are key to achieving SDGs? I think I'll leave it at that, and perhaps colleagues can jump in. Philani, you seem to be active, so you're not frozen, so it's fine. You can
Okay, perfect. But I'm glad you got through the questions. So I think colleagues can take it away. We could just start with the same order, starting with Sachin and then making our way down.
Thank you. Thanks, Philani. I think this idea of confusion of norms is something that I am also very keen to hear from my very dear friend Stefan. And he, as he rightly pointed out, it's not about geography and about location. It is very much about the way we resolve these contestations. And as Dr. Mayaki pointed out, the issue is how to work together, how to lay out the roadmap, how to bring in coherence in our strategies and go beyond the narrow national interests. Now, this is something which is holding us back in all the multilaterals, and as a result, growing traction for plurilaterals. And these plurilaterals are supposed to be the universe of new norms, as Patrick was pointing out, and with his trade hat on, with the forthcoming WTO ministerial, he would see the importance that the plurilaterals are getting. So I think it is important. The question is also about the way SDGs are being looked at and how we sort of reimagine these partnerships. And I think, in my view, the institutional mechanism would have to be inclusive. And as I said in my presentation, the current favored institution of GPEDC doesn't seem to provide that inclusive platform. But the trouble is that the DCF, the Development Cooperation Forum of the UN, is not also coming up to the expectations of the wider participants. So South would have to create some platform which brings in SDG-related initiatives together. And that's where a greater imagination is required. We are trying to explore these possibilities in NEST, the network of Southern think tanks. NEST Africa is providing wonderful leadership in getting these actors, ideas, institutions, and processes together for capturing the scope where more delivery is feasible. The voluntary national report VNRs, which are becoming a sort of national publication alone, I think they also require detailed analysis of cross-border connect of SDGs. SDGs are national responsibilities, national sort of a liquid space that has been given by the UN. So you are not accountable to report everything, and you are not crucified if you don't do that. But national governments would have to make an effort to see that in some goals, cross-border connects are there. And that's where academic leadership from the South can encourage subnational cooperation for learning for good practices. As I am myself doing this at a subnational level in India, where I'm very closely involved with the process and the government planning at the district level, and I'm trying to see how development at block level in a village setting can actually address sustainable development goals. So this, Pilani, I think is important for us to see what localization of development really means. And that's the new idea of partnership. Partnerships at the broad macro national level now no more means anything. The heterogeneity of development and the inequalities and the exclusions in development at the national level are blurring away the distinctions of the traditional North and South. North has its own pockets of South and South has its own pockets of North. We need to see how localization of development actually matters. And this is where the contestations of national level are going to blur away. That's where the new conceptual boundaries would have to be explored to see how localization of development can be addressed. And that's the new reality, that's the new process, and that's what we would have to address in the days to come. Academics would have to go beyond national boundaries to see how this localization can actually happen. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sachin. Can I ask Stefan to also come in with his inputs?
Yeah, just briefly on this question, what norm confusion means. I mean, just for the broader context, we have those debates, for example, led by Amitabh Arkhaya on how ideas spread on a global level, how norms spread, because we all know that those narratives, those concepts and the specific norms always matter. Yeah, how we frame our world. Yeah, global North, global South. Does it make sense? I mean, all these things are ideas, are norms, are narratives. And what we are discussing in several chapters is that development cooperation, or more specifically official development assistance of OECD DAC countries, and that this is one part of the history of development cooperation. Just one part. I mean, we have, also very traditional roots of South-South cooperation, but one part. And that was, for many decades, the dominating part of development cooperation. And that those norms coming from the Development Assistance Committee were, this was a platform in charge of providing norms. And I think it's not everything bad about, those ODA norms, etc. But this was the platform for development cooperation norms. The Busan high-level meeting in 2011 was a turning point, because that was a situation where many international actors, OECD actors, were, increasingly aware about the fact that South-South cooperation is now much more important in many African countries and also countries beyond Africa. And that this was the beginning of a competition. Yeah, South-South cooperation is different, sometimes much more attractive to partner countries. So the idea was, let's sit together and let's try to create something like a consensus on development cooperation norms. And in a way, this attempt was not successful for several reasons. I mean, this would lead to a debate where we would need to have much more time. But what we have right now is a situation where OECD DAC donors are still using their own set of norms, but those norms become more and more vague, I would say. There are some ideas what South-South cooperation is, a number of principles, but from my understanding, we do not have a specific set of criteria or norms. This is our definition, and every actor active in this field is using it, so it's a bit more unclear. Just to summarize it in a different way, I think for a number of years we had a discussion about the Northernization of South-South cooperation, that OECD countries were trying to explain to the Southern providers how to do it. Then we had this kind of, let's say, shifting context, shifting environment. And what we were discussing for a number of years is the Southernization of ODA, because ODA providers sometimes have this kind of impression, oh, what we offer might be less attractive than what Southern providers are offering. But I would say the reality is this kind of confusion that we do not have a dominating debate in this sphere. And this is why we are discussing, especially in the chapter, Paula Esteves and I are discussing this kind of norm confusion situation, which we are having for a couple of years now. Yeah. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Stefan. If I could ask Patrick to come in for your final inputs.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Filani. Before I make my final input, perhaps I just want to address the question talking about whether the partnerships can be of help in terms of so whether the new partnerships brings partnerships in MEs and SMEs in Europe and Africa in the successful horticulture sector in the region can provide a model. Yeah, of course, yeah, the answer is yes, they can provide a model, and I think the other, my answer also will be linked to the first point. So on the question of if there are certain partnerships in terms of trade arrangements that's involving an African country or another export destination, which may be a north country or a south country like China, etc., or India, then therefore those can only be replicated. But then also it offers opportunity for African countries, for instance, to know that their produce can be acceptable elsewhere, and therefore to be able to further address whether there are certain market access challenges to those produces, which is always paramount, and which is always one of the hindrances to effective trade across the world. So yes, those ones can offer models if they're those that have been successful, but also it can also give the African countries the chance to, under the AFCFTA or under the AU, to rethink of how do they build their capacities, and more importantly, how do they boost the intra-Africa trade? Because you see, as when you trade intra-Africa, the standards, your standards are almost already concomitant, and therefore it's easier to trade with your neighbor as opposed to 1,000 hurdles before you take your produce to elsewhere. And then also the first question on whether we can link together now that there's no coordination. I think Dr. Mayaki was, what is the leverage when African Union or regional organizations are really united in international settings? Of course, that's a challenge, and it boils down to it could actually fall under one of the contestations that there's whereas we have these catchphrase statements like Africa Rising or Africa We Want. Even within Africa, we still have a lot of suspicion with each other. But I think it's something that can start organically. There are already instruments. NEPAD is one of the institutions. AFCFTA is one of the institutions. AU is one of the institutions. These think tanks and such forums like this is one of those efforts that can, that can basically break down those barriers that were and make the continent more coordinated. I think that's what I wanted to mention. And then finally, also as regards the book talks about the chapter which I had a lot of interest in talking about financing. And I think I would also like to mention that, of course, as part of the global South cooperation, and as you all know, China has been spoken about in almost all discussions in depth. So I think it's also part of the things that African countries can think about how do we want to engage with China in terms of debt, how do we want to use the debt sustainably, and how the other multilateral countries, including the Bretton Woods institutions, coming in to support all these structures that ensure that this debt, this financing is going actually towards delivering for the SDGs, as opposed to, for instance, just fueling the recurrent budgets in the different governments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fascinating conversation, colleagues. A lot of interesting insights. And I think it's very clear that there's some level of adaptation that is going to take place in terms of the North accommodating the South, but the South also accommodating and building bridges with the North in this changing landscape. Before Elizabeth gives a final wrap up, I would like to also just get maybe a final impressions from Dr. Mayaki. Just a final input from you, Dr. Mayaki. Okay, I see Dr. Mayaki is still on mute. Elizabeth, maybe if Dr. Mayaki is not able to link in, if I would just hand it over to you.
Thanks, Pelani. Let me just say very, very briefly, because we have exceeded our time, but it's really to thank everybody, I think, for a very rich discussion. I want to sort of conclude by where Dr. Mayaki started. And, he started by saying, if we're thinking about rethinking partnerships, actually what is very much connected with rethinking partnerships is rethinking development. And this theme has come out in many of the remarks and observations made by colleagues, as well as by the participants. And I think part of that rethinking of development is very much this localization of development that Sachin also spoke about in his last remarks. And I've seen here that my good friend San has commented, San Bilal in the chat has commented about the importance of women's empowerment. And I think localization of development is very much about thinking of that dimension as well, critical dimension, particularly if we think about, we had the stats about, in Africa, 80%, we're looking at about 80% informalization. Much of that is women, or many of those are women. And I think the pandemic has actually affected those the most. And if part of that rethinking development is very much about how we in Africa have pivoted now to looking at it through our Agenda 2063 through the prism of a post-pandemic reality, then women are at the center of that in terms of how we do development differently. Because I would say that they have often, not just in the South, but in the North as well, been sort of, we think about them a little later. They're not at the center yet. They should be at the center of our societies, and we know what happens when that is not the case. Let me thank particularly my colleague Luanda Mpangosi, who's actually put this event together, and our partnership with Pelani and the IGD, and of course my co-editors Stefan and Sachin, Patrick for joining us, and Dr. Mayaki, if he can unmute. I'm happy for him to make the closing remarks if he can unmute. But thanks colleagues for joining us, and apologies for running a little over time. Thank you. I think Dr. Mayaki is probably still battling. So, Pelani, should I then close this formally? All right, then colleagues, thank you. Have a good afternoon, have a good morning, and it's been wonderful to see people join us from all over the world. I think that's what's amazing about this post or COVID world that we're in. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Elizabeth. Thanks, Philani.
For colleagues,
Thank
we
you.
will
Thank
be
you,
posting
colleagues.
the YouTube. We will be posting the YouTube video, so it will be available, and you can pass it on also to people who were unable to attend. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.